Okay, so this is the second part of the memory lecture from Tuesday that I wasn't able to finish. Shouldn't be too terribly long, but this should help you finish filling out your notes. So for the memory processes, we talked about these. There's encoding, storage, and retrieval, but there's also consolidation, which is the process of solidifying memories. Okay, so that process happens mainly when you're asleep. You consolidate your memories, which is essentially getting rid of extraneous information that you don't need to know, and making the gist of the memory what you remember. Okay, so now we're moving on to ways in which you can increase getting information into your long-term memory. Okay, so this is ways you should study to get more information into your long-term memory. The first is elaborative rehearsal. Okay, so elaborative rehearsal is a way to get info from short-term to long-term memory. Like I said, what you do is you relate the information to information that already exists in your long-term memory. So the best thing that will help you get information out of your memory stores is that it's connected to lots of different things in your memory. Okay, so you want to connect it to something you already know. Additionally, it's been demonstrated that if you relate material to yourself, you're able to better remember it. And that's the self-reference effect. That if you relate new information to yourself, your own experiences, you're going to be much better able to remember it. Okay, so my very educated mother just served us noodles. This is a mnemonic device for remembering the planets in the solar system. Many of you maybe have heard of that. So that's a mnemonic device. There's lots of other mnemonic devices like the order of operations, PEMDAS, or please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. There's lots of mnemonic devices that help us improve our encoding so we can remember things. Distributed practice, basically practicing over time. We know that studying in smaller chunks over the course of a week will give you the same retention as if you cram for almost double the time the night before an exam. So you actually are saving yourself a lot of time if you distribute your practice over time, and that's called the spacing effect. And then, of course, over learning and over practicing is going to be the best way to make sure that you really have good encoding into your memory system and you're able to remember everything that you need to. So once you get information into your memory system, eventually you'll want to get it back out. Otherwise, there would be really no purpose. Okay, so accessing stored information from memory is what retrieval is called. There are three methods for measuring how we get information out of our memory system. Those are recall, recognition, and relearning. Okay, so recall is your ability to just know the definition of a term. So if I give you the term and you're able to rattle off the definition, that's recall. Recognition is when you can just recognize the correct answer. So think like a multiple choice question. You just have to recognize the correct answer. And then relearning is a process that we use in research, not really in real life, but essentially it's a way to tell how much information is in your memory, because when you have to relearn something for a second time, you'll be much more quick to learn it a second time. So this clicker participation question poll is measuring your recognition, okay, because a multiple choice question is recognition. Early memory research. Ebbinghaus was an early memory researcher, and he did a ton of experiments basically having people memorize nonsense words. So he actually did a user relearning task. So he would have them memorize lists of words, and you could see that once you've memorized a list, over the course of a few short days, you lose most of that retention, and then it levels off. And this is what we call the forgetting curve. Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve is that you forget most of the things within a few days, and then the rest of it sort of stays in your memory system. And here's a close-up. When I was in graduate school, I had a faculty member who gave an exam. I did really well. I made like an 87% on the exam. It was very hard. He then, a week later, without telling anyone, gave us all the exact same exam. On the second exam, I made, I think it was about a 58. So you can see how that example mimics the forgetting curve. You forget most of that information quickly. A way to avoid that is to not cram. So if you distribute your practice over time, there's a better chance that the forgetting curve will be mitigated. Okay. So practicing retrieval, so actually practicing answering questions, getting information out of your memory system is one of the best ways to study and enhance your long-term memory. And that's called the testing effect. So basically what you want to do is take as many practice tests as you can get your hands on and actually just practice testing. Testing effect shows us that it's really the most effective way to study. So flashcards are one way to take advantage of that, right? Because you're practicing retrieving the information from your long-term memory. Rereading is not the best way to study. In fact, it's about the worst way to study. You want to read your text once and read it well, thoroughly, giving it 100% of your attention, and then you really don't want to read it again. There are only minimal gains in terms of how well you'll do on a test if you just reread the textbook. So context cues aid in retrieval. Basically, where you study, you should try to be in a similar environment to how you're going to take a test. You don't want to study in a noisy environment if you're going to be going into a completely quiet environment for test taking. And generation effect, that says that generating the information aids in later retrieval. What does that mean? Well, if I can come up with my own examples of the concepts, that's me generating information, and that's going to help me remember things later if I can create my own examples. Myths. We don't get new wrinkles when we learn things. Yeah, we talked about that already. And we do not learn best when the teaching method matches our learning style. Learning style research is completely bunk. I apologize if I'm popping this bubble for you. There is basically no empirical evidence that learning styles are a thing. So no, you're not an auditory learner. I apologize. It is absolutely true that diversifying the methodology of how you learn is helpful, but that same way is it's helpful for everyone. So seeing an image, hearing, and reading, these are all ways to learn, and some people are better at learning than others. But there's no research that says teaching method matching your learning style helps you learn more. Okay, forgetting. So commonly, when we think of forgetting, we think about information being lost from our memory system. It's not super accurate. Really, what forgetting is a difficulty retrieving information. Because what we know from relearning is that the information doesn't necessarily get lost or it's not gone from our memory. We just can't get it back out. And so that's when you see things like tip of the tongue phenomenon, like, oh, that word that I need is right there, I just can't get to it. It's still in there. You're just having difficulty retrieving it from your long-term memory. So if I give you this series of penny images, it might be difficult for you to determine which one is actually accurate. I usually do this as a polling question. And I can tell you that the correct answer is A. Okay, so A is actually the correct answer. Most people aren't able to do that. And that's because of encoding failure. Encoding failure is when forgetting is due to actually not ever getting the information into your long-term memory. So specific information we don't ever put out of our short-term into our long-term memory. So it's not that we have lost it, it's that we never actually remembered it in the first place. Another theory of why we forget is storage decay. This is basically the use it or lose it theory. Over time, if we aren't recalling information, if we aren't retrieving it, I should say, we're going to lose our ability in context cues and the ability to retrieve it ever. Interference, we'll talk about interference. Basically, interference is when information that we have learned since that piece of information or information we learned before interferes and makes it more difficult for us to clearly remember. So my example for interference is always learning more than one language. So if you try to learn Spanish first and then you learn French, your ability to remember one or the other might be influenced. So proactive interference is when old memories interfere with new memories, and retroactive interference is when new memories interfere with old memories. And that on the image is a mnemonic device to remember interference. And then the last theory is cue dependent, which says we have an inability to access information without the proper retrieval cues. If a piece of information doesn't have a lot of retrieval cues, it will be difficult to remember it. So again, when I said elaborative rehearsal earlier, you want to connect pieces of information to as many retrieval cues as possible so that you don't end up with the inability to remember it. And that's the end.